It all started like any normal summer day. A group of 10 Boy Scouts went on a fun trip to explore a quiet cave in West Virginia. Everyone was excited, laughing, and ready for adventure. But by the end of the day, something was very wrong. One of the boys was missing. No one had seen him leave or heard him call for help. Panic began to spread through the group. What was supposed to be a simple outdoor trip quickly turned into a nightmare. A young boy had disappeared underground, and no one knew where he was or how to find him. Before we dive into video, please subscribe our channel. As always, viewer discretion is advised. The day began with excitement and laughter as the group of Boy Scouts arrived near Killiansburg Cave. It was a warm June morning, and the boys were full of energy, eager to explore the outdoors. The cave itself didn't look like much from the outside. Just a quiet, hidden spot near the Potomac River in West Virginia. But to a group of adventurous teens, it felt like the perfect place to create summer memories. With flashlights in, hand and backpacks ready, the boys began exploring the cave's main passages. They joked with each other, shared stories, and marveled at the underground world around them. The inside of the cave was cool and damp, and the walls echoed with the sound of their laughter. It was a bonding experience, far from the noise of everyday life, deep in nature. Just boys being boys. Everything felt exciting and safe. The group stayed mostly together, sticking to known trails and paths inside the cave, following the natural flow of the underground tunnels. There was a sense of freedom in the air. No parents, no school, just nature, adventure, and friendship. It felt like nothing could go wrong. But in this moment of joy and freedom, something important was overlooked. Not everyone was following the same path. Among the group was Brian, a curious 13-year-old who had a habit of exploring the unknown. While the others stayed in the main areas, Brian wandered off toward a narrow, almost invisible passage. It didn't look dangerous, just small and a little more hidden than the rest. He probably thought it led to something cool or interesting. At the time, no one noticed he was missing, and no one thought to ask where he had gone. The adventure had just begun, but danger was already waiting in the shadows. While the other boys explored the main passages of the cave, Brian noticed something different. Tucked into the wall was a small, narrow opening, barely big enough for someone his size. Most people wouldn't have looked twice at it, but Brian was curious by nature. To him, this hidden path wasn't just a crack in the wall. It was a secret, maybe even a shortcut to another part of the cave. Without telling anyone, he crouched down and peered into the opening. It was dark, tight, and twisted like an L shape. Still, he felt drawn to it. Something about the mystery made him want to go in. Brian slowly began crawling inside. The walls were so close that he could barely move his shoulders. Every inch forward felt harder than the last. The passage wrapped tightly around him, forcing him to push with his toes and squeeze his arms in. When he reached the sharp bend in the path, he realized this wasn't going to be easy. To continue, he had to twist his body in a strange, painful way, bending his knees awkwardly and forcing his legs into an uncomfortable shape. Even though it hurt, Brian kept going. The thought of reaching something amazing on the other side kept him moving forward. He finally made it past the bend and found himself in a slightly wider space. For a moment, he felt proud. He had gone where no one else had. But that feeling didn't last long. The narrow walls behind him, the strange angle of the path, and the painful position of his body were about to trap him. What started as an exciting adventure was slowly becoming a nightmare, and the deeper he went, the harder it would be to turn back. As Brian continued forward, the passage began to feel more like a trap than an adventure. When he reached the sharp bend, he quickly realized the difficulty of going any further. The space was tight, forcing him to twist his body in unnatural ways. His knees had to bend in an awkward, painful angle, pushing his legs into a hyperextended position. It was an uncomfortable and unnatural movement, but Brian was determined. He knew that once he got through this bend, the passage would widen, and he could explore the cave's hidden parts. With great effort, he managed to push his way through, feeling the tight walls scrape against his skin. As he emerged into the slightly wider section, he paused for a moment, catching his breath. The relief of passing through the hardest part was short-lived. In that moment, a sudden realization hit him like a cold wave. He couldn't move anymore. The position of his body, the tight squeeze of the passage, and the angle of his knees made it almost impossible for him to go forward or backward. Panic began to set in as Brian tried to wriggle free. His body refused to cooperate, the constriction too tight. His movements were limited, and the more he struggled, the more he realized how stuck he was. The sense of freedom that had first drawn him into the cave was now replaced with an overwhelming feeling of dread. His arms were pinned to his sides, and his legs were stuck at an uncomfortable angle. It was a nightmare that seemed to grow worse with every passing second. He was trapped, alone in a small, dark cave, unable to escape. At first, the other boys didn't notice Brian was missing. They were too wrapped up in their own exploration, enjoying the adventure. But as time passed, a sense of unease started to creep in. It had been too long since Brian wandered off. They began calling his name, retracing their steps, and looking around the familiar passages. When they still couldn't find him, worry turned into panic. Brian wasn't where they expected him to be. No one had seen him take a different route, and the narrow passage he had entered was completely unknown to them. As the minutes ticked by, their calls grew more desperate. "Brian!" they shouted, their voices echoing through the cave. There was no answer. The group started to feel the weight of their mistake. They hadn't even considered that he might have gone down that narrow, hidden path. They kept calling, their voices bouncing off the cave's walls, but still, there was no sign of him. Meanwhile, Brian, wedged in the narrow passage, heard the faint calls of his friends. The sound was distant but clear. He mustered what little strength he had left and tried to shout back. His voice was muffled, barely audible, as his body was still twisted awkwardly in the constricted space. Fear crept into his mind as he realized his friends were searching for him, but he couldn't make himself heard. His cries came out as weak, strained sounds, full of panic. The more he tried to yell, the harder it became. The tightness of the passage made it difficult to breathe or move, let alone shout for help. Then, in a moment of realization, the group heard something. Muffled cries echoing through the cave. They rushed toward the sound, and soon, they found the entrance to the narrow passage. But when they looked inside, all they could see were Brian's legs. The rest of him was hidden from view, and no one had any idea how to help him. The situation was getting serious, and fear quickly turned into a desperate urgency. The group of boys gathered at the entrance of the narrow passage, helpless and unsure of what to do. They could only see Brian's legs, wedged tightly inside the tight space, but couldn't make out the rest of his body. Panic set in as they realized the gravity of the situation. Brian had been stuck for longer than anyone had expected, and the boys weren't sure how to help him. They tried calling out to him, hoping for a response, but his muffled cries only fueled their fear. His voice was faint, full of fear and desperation. Some of the boys tried pulling on his legs, but the position of his body made it impossible to get any leverage. Every attempt seemed to make things worse. Brian's knees were hyperextended, causing him excruciating pain, and his attempts to shift his position were futile. The narrow passage seemed to tighten with every move, making it even harder for him to get free. The air inside the cave felt thick, and the walls seemed to close in around him. Brian's breathing became shallow and rapid, each breath a painful struggle. His chest was bent unnaturally, and the pressure on his body was relentless. It felt like the cave itself was suffocating him. His face contorted with pain, and his body trembled with exhaustion. The boys on the outside could only watch, unable to do anything but offer words of encouragement, though their voices trembled with uncertainty. The situation was dire, and the sense of helplessness was overwhelming. Brian's panic deepened as the reality of being trapped set in. Tears streamed down his face as he pleaded for help. He was stuck in a position where he couldn't move, and every passing minute felt like an eternity. The other boys couldn't offer much more than their presence, but they knew that time was running out. The longer Brian remained stuck, the more dangerous the situation became. The news of Brian's disappearance and the desperate situation quickly reached the scout leader, who happened to be Brian's mother. When she arrived at the cave entrance, Her heart dropped in an instant. The sight of her son's feet, the only part of him visible from the tight passage, brought an overwhelming mix of relief and terror. She knew he was alive, but the sight of his body twisted and stuck in that narrow space was a mother's worst nightmare. Every instinct in her screamed to help him, but the cave's cramped, unyielding walls left little room for action. With a steady, trembling voice, she called out to him. "Brian, can you hear me?" she asked, her heart racing. Brian's muffled response came through, filled with fear but also relief. At least he was conscious. At least he knew she was there. She crawled closer, trying to assess the situation. But the narrowness of the passage made it nearly impossible for her to see exactly how he was stuck. Her mind raced as she realized that the only way to free him was for Brian to retrace his steps. To get out, he would need to go backward through the same painful, twisted path he had taken. His body was in an unnatural position, and every movement would hurt, but it was the only option. His legs were hyperextended, and getting him out was going to take every ounce of strength he had left. She spoke softly to him, trying to keep him calm and focused. "Brian, listen to me. You have to do what you did before, but in reverse. I'm here. I'll help you." Brian was scared, crying, and hesitant, but his mother's voice was a comforting anchor. Despite the agony of the task ahead, he trusted her. He had no choice. With a deep breath, he started moving, and his mother was there every step of the way, ready to pull him out of the nightmare. The moment Brian began to move, the pain was immediate and unbearable. His body, already stiff and trapped in an unnatural position, had to twist again through the sharp bend he had previously navigated. Every inch of progress felt like torture. As his mother pulled on his legs, he let out a raw, primal scream. The sharp, jagged rock scraped against his skin, and his knees felt as though they were being pulled apart. Every shift, every movement sent waves of excruciating pain through his legs and back. His body resisted, refusing to cooperate, but he had no choice but to keep going. His mother's hands trembled as she gripped his legs, pulling him inch by painful inch. Each time he moved, his body scraped against the rough walls of the passage, leaving deep marks on his skin. His breath came in short, frantic bursts. It felt as if the walls were closing in on him, making it harder and harder to move. His mind screamed for him to stop, to escape the overwhelming agony, but his mother's calm, steady voice was his only guide. The other scouts stood outside, pale and silent, unable to do anything except wait and listen to the sounds of Brian's struggle. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, their faces full of worry and guilt, while others stared at the ground, unable to meet each other's eyes. The weight of helplessness hung heavily over them. They couldn't offer anything more than moral support as Brian's mother continued the slow, painful process of freeing her son. Every inch felt like an eternity. Brian's cries echoed in the narrow passage, each one a desperate plea for relief. His mother's voice cracked as she whispered words of encouragement, but she too was exhausted. She didn't stop pulling, knowing that every second mattered. Finally, after what felt like forever, Brian's torso emerged from the tight passage, and with one last agonizing pull, his mother freed him from the cave's suffocating grip. After being freed from the passage, Brian collapsed onto the wider part of the cave floor, his body trembling with exhaustion and pain. He was sobbing uncontrollably, the emotional and physical toll of the experience overwhelming him. The tight, suffocating space that had once seemed like an exciting adventure now felt like a prison, and the fear of being trapped had taken its toll on his mind. His chest heaved as he gasped for air, trying to recover from the panic attack that had begun to take hold of him. The tight cave air, the oppressive darkness, and the feeling of being completely trapped had all combined to make the experience unbearable. Despite his body being free, Brian's mind remained caught in the claustrophobic grip of the cave. He couldn't shake the feeling of being suffocated, the tightness in his chest, the fear of being trapped again, and the sense of helplessness lingered in his thoughts. His mother, still shaking from the ordeal, helped him to his feet, but Brian's panic was not over. The cave that had once been an exciting, mysterious place now seemed to close in on him with every step. Every movement felt like he was being pulled back into the suffocating darkness. With his mother's comforting presence, they hurried out of the cave. The closer they got to the entrance, the more Brian's panic intensified. He felt the open space above him, but it didn't bring relief. It only made him more aware of how trapped he had felt just moments ago. When they finally reached the cave's entrance and stepped into the sunlight, the sudden brightness was almost blinding. It was like a burst of freedom, but it also reminded him of everything he had just survived. Brian collapsed onto the grass outside the cave, gasping for breath. The fresh air felt almost too much after the tight, oppressive cave. His mother stayed by his side, exhausted but relieved that he was finally out. Though his body had been freed, the emotional scars from the experience would linger for much longer. In the days following the incident, Brian's body healed, but the emotional scars of his ordeal remained. The physical pain may have faded, but the memory of being trapped in that narrow passage, helpless and terrified, lingered in his mind. He struggled with anxiety and claustrophobia, triggered by the thought of being in tight spaces. The cave, which once seemed like an exciting adventure, now haunted him, reminding him of the fear he had felt in those suffocating moments. His friends, who had witnessed the terrifying scene, couldn't forget the sight of Brian stuck and in pain. They had seen their friend at his most vulnerable, and the experience left them shaken as well. While Brian slowly tried to recover, the emotional weight of the experience stayed with him. The bond between him and his mother grew stronger as she had been there every step of the way, supporting him through unimaginable pain and fear. Yet the trauma of the experience didn't simply go away. The event changed Brian. He wasn't the same carefree boy who had crawled into that cave in search of adventure. The fear he had faced, the helplessness of being trapped, and the desperation to escape were things he would carry with him for years to come. Every time he thought about the cave, he felt a rush of panic, and even the smallest tight spaces would make him uneasy. The cave had stolen more than just his sense of adventure. It had taken a part of his innocence. He had survived, but the emotional scars would remain, a constant reminder of the terrifying experience that, for better or worse, had shaped him forever.